all of you today. Today's session is about achieving product market fit. My plan is to take the first hour with a presentation about how to go about achieving product market fit, what my experience has been in this regard. And then we will have a fireside chat with the entrepreneur that I've invited, who's gone through that experience, and we'll learn about the experience that she's had in achieving product market fit as well. So today's session will be somewhat longer. Potentially it could take more than an hour and a half. So I think I'd mentioned that the last time around, but I'm sure you'll find this content quite interesting. Before I get started, let me quickly introduce myself. I'm a TiE Seattle board member. I've been involved with TiE Seattle since its inception, since 2000 timeframe. Before that, I started my career at Microsoft. I've been a veteran of Microsoft from the very early days. And then I started a career as an entrepreneur. I've done 3 different startups, 2 of which have had successful exits with Research in Motion and Rosetta Stone. And I'll talk more about that in this presentation. As before, please feel free to type in your questions as we go along in the chat window. I'll keep an eye on that, and Minnie will also keep an eye on that, and then we'll answer questions as we go along. So let me talk about now my journey and some of the lessons I've learned about achieving product market fit. As an entrepreneur, as I mentioned, I've had 2 successful exits. That was because I was able to achieve product market fit in those 2 situations. One of the companies I started, in fact, I had to go through a pivot before achieving product market fit, and then ultimately selling that company to Research in Motion. And then the last company, unfortunately, even though we had a successful mobile application, we got to around 2 million downloads. We ultimately did not achieve product market fit, and we had to shut down the company. So, not being able to achieve product market fit can be often the death knell of a company. And so it's very important to think through exactly how you can go about achieving product market fit. So the term product market fit was originally popularized by Mark Andreessen. And according to Mark, product market fit means being able to provide a product in a good market that can satisfy the market needs. Essentially, it means that you should make something that a lot of people want. Now, achieving product market fit is only the first step in the process. You also have to achieve what I'd call product business market fit, which means that you can actually develop a business model that will allow you to build a profitable company, a venture scale company that can scale to hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. A lot of companies can achieve product market fit, especially if they provide a free product, but then they fail because they don't have a business model that can scale to hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue and can get the funding from VCs to continue building out that product. But generally, if you do have product market fit and you're able to achieve significant growth in terms of customers, you should be able to build a business model that is attractive for the company. There are lots of examples of companies that have built great products. One of my favorite examples is that of the BlackBerry device. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with the BlackBerry device. It came out in 1999. What I like about the BlackBerry device is that it was a very focused device. It was focused primarily on providing a great email experience. And it was not a PDA by design. At that time, Palm was the device that was well known in the industry. When mobile connectivity became available, they came out with the Palm 7 device. But they failed with that device because they didn't really provide a great mobile experience. Whereas the BlackBerry, even though it came out, as you see in the screen, with the device in a pager form factor, executed really, really well in terms of providing a great email experience. Even the screen, as you can see, was really small. People were able to access their corporate email because they provided end-to-end encryption. They had what was known as push email delivery, and then they had a great keyboard that allowed you to respond to those emails. And so BlackBerry, even though in its early incarnation, was not a great handheld device, it provided a great email experience and satisfied a tremendous need at that point. And then from there on, they evolved and built a great PDA with mobile connectivity. Let's talk about the road to product market fit. Most entrepreneurs make the mistake of building a product first. They feel that if they build a great product, that customers will come and they will be successful. But really the first step in getting to product market fit is to really think through the problem. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? You have to make sure that it's a problem that is really a pounding headache for the customer. As most VCs will say, what you need to build is an aspirin, not a vitamin. So you need to make sure that you've identified a really tremendous problem that customers are having. The next step is to formulate a compelling solution that addresses that particular need or problem. Meet with customers to validate both your problem hypothesis as well as your solution. Show them some prototypes first, get their feedback to make sure you're on the right path. And then the next step is to build out an MVP. We'll talk more about what it means to build out an MVP. Get that in front of your customers. And the most important thing at this point is to really track your engagement and retention metrics and see how are people reacting to your product. It's not sufficient to get some POCs or customer trials. You need to see that the customers are really engaged with your product, that they keep coming back to use the product. And then you need to either, if you're making progress, if you're seeing increased engagement, increased retention, then you continue to iterate through your MVP till you have a product that can be launched in the market. If you're not achieving what you feel as product market fit, and your engagement is not very strong or your retention is not very strong, then you should consider pivoting to a different solution. And again, go back to your customers, understand if you have really identified their problem, and if your problem hypothesis still is valid, then perhaps the solution is not hitting the mark. And so you need to think through again how to formulate your product and go through that process all over again. Again, we'll go into more detail through the remaining slides. So how do you know that you have achieved product market fit? Let me first say that user growth by itself does not equate to product market fit. There are many examples of that in the marketplace. In 2012, you had this company called BranchOut, which was trying to compete with LinkedIn, and they were trying to build out their network of users on Facebook. And at that time, Facebook made it possible for you to reach out to people's social graph and spam them. And so BranchOut used a very clever technique to convince their users to spam or reach out to their friends. And they were quickly able to get to over 30 million registered users. And as you can see in this graph, they grew very rapidly. And on the basis of that growth, they were able to raise almost $50 million of funding. But they did not pay attention to engagement and retention. And around 2013 timeframe, Facebook shut off access to the social graph. And so their growth came down significantly. And then they started losing their existing users because they didn't really have a product that was addressing a compelling need. And you can see in this chart, their user growth dropped off and their monthly active users dropped off dramatically. And then they finally had to shut down the company. So it's a great example of a company that was successful in achieving tremendous growth, but really didn't pay attention to user engagement and retention. Ultimately, the product failed. So what are some of the metrics that you should look at as you are tracking your engagement and retention with your customers? Andrew Chen, who's a famous blogger, has a set of metrics that you can track that I think can give you a good sense of whether you are achieving product market fit or not. If you look at a consumer, a B2C product, for consumer products, what you should see is usage every 3 out of 7 days. So you want to see a situation where people are connecting almost every other day, if not every day. You want to see organic growth initially of hundreds and eventually thousands of signups a day. You want to see strong retention. We'll talk more about tracking what I call retention cohorts and what that means. But you want to see at least 30 to 40% of your users coming back the following day after sign up. And then with the signups that you're seeing, you want to see a clear path to 100,000 users. So those are some of the metrics that you should be tracking if you're a B2C product. If you're a enterprise or a B2B product, then there are a different set of metrics that you should be tracking. You want to see at least a 3 to 5% conversion rate from free to paid. You want to track your customer acquisition cost, which is called CAC, as well as the lifetime value of the customer. And typically most VCs want to see businesses that have a ratio of 3 to 1. So for every dollar that you spend on customer acquisition, you want to see $3 to $5 in LTV, or the lifetime value of the customer. You want to see, again, strong retention. So typically you want to target a churn rate that is less than 2%. a month. And then finally, you want to see a clear path to 100,000 monthly recurring revenue. So these are some good metrics that you should be, again, tracking as far as a B2B product is concerned. Before we get into the tactics of how to go about achieving product market fit, let me talk about it from a strategic perspective, because you need to figure out, is the category that you're entering, does it lend itself to a new entrant in that space? And one of the lessons that I have learned in my career, especially when I started off at Microsoft in the early days of MS-DOS, is that incumbents are really very hard to displace. When I joined Microsoft in 1987, at that time, I don't know how many of you remember this, but the market leaders on MS-DOS were Lotus 1-2-3, in the spreadsheet market. WordPerfect was the leader in the word processing market, and then DBase was the leader in the database market. And Microsoft had its own products at that time on MS-DOS. We had Microsoft Word. We had something called Multiplan, which was a spreadsheet before Excel came onto the market, and so forth. And even though they were good products, we really had a very hard time making any inroads against the market share leaders, because people were used to those user interfaces, which at that time were keyboard based. In the case of Lotus 1-2-3, they were they had built macros, and so there was a lot of investment that companies had made in Lotus 1-2-3, etc. And so it became very hard for Microsoft to really make any kind of headway in achieving product market fit and user growth because of these incumbents. And generally what happens is that it takes a major platform shift to displace powerful incumbents in the market. And so what happened, the reason today everybody's using Microsoft Office is that Microsoft introduced Windows, and eventually with Windows 3.1, which was introduced in 92 timeframe, Windows 3.1 started becoming popular. And most of the incumbents were late to building their products for Windows. They didn't want Windows to become successful. They made the mistake of porting their DOS applications to Windows and didn't really build great applications from the ground up for the Windows platform to take advantage of the graphical user interface capabilities that Windows provided. And so they were late to the market with poorly built products, whereas Microsoft obviously built great products built from the ground up for Windows. And so that was the reason why Microsoft, as Windows became successful, they rode the wave to, as the market converted from DOS to Windows, people obviously looked for applications that were optimized for the Windows platform. And eventually, Microsoft, bought PowerPoint and they, consolidated all these applications into one platform called Microsoft Office. And that's how Microsoft Office was ultimately able to capture this market. And so a key point to understand as you're thinking about your company is, who are the incumbents in the market, and what platform shifts are happening that you can take advantage of that the incumbents typically don't take advantage of, that would allow you to displace those incumbents. So the best opportunities, therefore, for disruption are really where there's either a technology innovation that's happening, or as I mentioned, there's a platform shift. And there are many examples of companies that have disrupted existing players in the market. We're well aware of the example of Amazon, which took advantage of the shift to the internet to initially displace Barnes and Noble, and obviously then expanded to become a general purpose e-commerce platform. In the mobile space, there's a company called OfferUp here, based out of Seattle, which is a marketplace for used goods, and they went against Craigslist, which was the incumbent before for used goods, and they provided a great mobile experience, which Craigslist was very late in providing, and now OfferUp is one of the leading marketplaces for used goods. And then finally, in the cloud environment, you have a company called Snowflake, which built a data warehousing product from the ground up for a cloud-based environment. And as the cloud started taking hold in the 2010 timeframe, they were able to compete successfully against one of the incumbents in the marketplace, which was Teradata. So there are many examples of companies that have leveraged platform shifts or technology innovations. A big technology innovation that's happening today that many companies are taking advantage of is obviously the shift to AI and ML, which is allowing companies to really build out new products that can satisfy customer needs in a more effective fashion. Another opportunity for companies to really enter the market and successfully displace incumbents is where there's a global industry transformation. And here I can talk about my own personal story with a company called TiE, which was founded in 2007, just when there was a convergence of globalization, the emergence of broadband internet, the emergence of social networking, Facebook, LinkedIn at that time. And we pioneered, so that was the time when, because of globalization, there was a tremendous need for people around the world to learn English. And there were literally over 1 billion people looking to learn English to improve their lives, get access to higher paying jobs, etc. And so at that time, we launched LimeMocha, which pioneered the notion of social language learning, where not only were you learning a language, but you could connect with native speakers around the world. And we grew to over 15 million members in over 200 different countries. Today, with COVID-19, you're seeing a similar set of industry transformations, new opportunities that are emerging with virtual work. You've seen companies like Zoom take off. You're seeing a tremendous demand for e-commerce. You're seeing tremendous demand for online education, for digital transformation. So from time to time, you will see global industry events happening that will create new opportunities for companies to enter the market with new products that can satisfy these emerging needs. So I want to make sure that you all understand from a strategic perspective, what is it that you need to think about before you enter a specific market. You want to make sure that there's either a platform shift or technology innovation or a global industry transformation that's happening that would allow your company to succeed. Now, you certainly, once you enter a market, because of these opportunities, you still have to achieve product market fit, but your chances of achieving product market fit are much higher because of these global industry events and platform innovations. So let's now discuss from a tactical perspective what you need to do to achieve product market fit. The first step in the process is to test the market. You want to spend time interviewing customers, one of the most important things that you should consider when you interview customers is, ask them, what are their top 3 problems before you even discuss a solution. What a lot of companies make the mistake of is to show their solution first to potential customers and then ask them if they would be interested in that solution. And most of the time, people, don't want to be rude. They might even find the solution that you built to be interesting, but it is not addressing their top 3 problems. And so when it comes time to actually selling your solution to the market, they don't take the time to look at your solution and purchase that solution because they don't really have that pain point. It's not a burning pain point that they have. And so as a result, your sales cycles, tend to be very long, and it becomes very difficult to convert those customers into, or those potential customers into paying customers. So you really need to understand, is there a burning problem that you are addressing? So you need to understand, if you look at this chart here, on the y-axis, you have importance of user need. You want to make sure that there is a strong need, a burning problem. And then you need to understand, how are customers addressing that need at that point? Are they, have they built their own in-house solution? Are they using competitors? And what is their level of satisfaction with competitive solution? The best opportunities are ones where, they've tried to, hack together their own solution, which obviously they're not capable of maintaining. And you're able to come in and provide a solution that addresses their burning need. So the market opportunity lies where the need is high and there's significant dissatisfaction with existing solutions that you can address. The other things that you can do, and this is probably more true for B2C solutions, is even if before you build out your product, you should look at using Google SEM or Facebook ads to test out the value proposition, test out different messaging, bring customers to a landing page which outlines your value proposition, and then see how many of them you can sign up to become, registered users. And obviously at that time you don't have a product, but you can say, hey, we'll have a product soon, and please register for the beta for the product. And so you can get a really good sense for how customers are reacting to you can test out different types of messaging with your Google ads or your Facebook ads. You can test out different messaging on your landing page, and you can get a really good sense for your customer acquisition cost, which will help you understand, how quickly you can, get customers to try out your product. And then finally, you can consider building out prototypes of your product, testing that with potential customers, and seeing which concepts are really resonating, with them. The next step in the process is to build out your minimal, viable product. And honestly, I'm not in love with this term. My preferred term is minimum delightful product, because you need to have, some core value proposition that delights the customer. So if you think about, all the different elements that you need to build out in your product, whether it's the functionality, how reliable it is, how usable it is, and then finally, the delightful aspect of your product. What you don't want to do is, build out a lot of features, but do a poor job of really building out the one thing that delights the customers. Instead, what you need to do is, what's on the right of the chart is, build out the minimum functionality that delights the customer. So going back to my earlier example of the RIM product, they didn't have a great device. It was based on a pager device initially, but they had a delightful experience with the email experience that they delivered, where people could very easily access the email on the go without having to carry their laptop with them. And so think about what are the one or two features that can really delight your customers, and then over time you can expand the functionality that you provide with the product to address their needs. So let's go a little bit into greater detail in terms of what is the process for building out your product market fit. The first thing I recommend is really to focus in on a very narrow customer segment or location. I talked about the example of OfferUp, which is a platform or a marketplace for used goods. When they launched initially, they launched only in the Seattle market, and they were able to build a critical mass of users in the Seattle market and create a vibrant marketplace. And they developed their methodology or their playbook for the Seattle market. Then they were able to replicate into other markets. They didn't go out and do a nationwide launch, which I think would have failed for them. So again, I recommend very highly that if you're a B2C product, you might want to focus on a certain demographic, or only on if it's an e-commerce product, only on women as the target audience, and you can target your marketing efforts to only acquiring customers in that segment. If you're a B2B product, you might want to focus on a specific vertical market and really understand their needs and address their needs in a very specific fashion before you branch out into other customer segments. Your path to product market fit is going to be much faster if you focus in on a narrow customer segment. The second thing that I recommend is, and again, this is probably more true for B2C products versus B2B products, but even there, I think you should consider this strategy, which is to build out a daily use case, or at least a weekly use case. If you look at our usage of our mobile devices, probably the ones that you use the most are the ones that you use on a daily basis. And so you want to make sure that you have content or you have use cases that are inspiring you to use the application on either a daily basis or at least on a weekly basis. And if you do that, then you're more likely to engage with the product. And as you engage more with the product, you're more likely to come back and use the product again, and your retention is going to be much stronger. Once you do that, you want to then engage in a process of rapid iteration and testing. You want to interview customers, understand what's blocking. If you're seeing that they're not using certain features, you want to use a combination of usability tests and customer interviews to understand what's blocking the usage of those features. And then, as I mentioned, you want to track your engagement and retention metrics and see how that is changing over time, and then iterate with the product to increase your daily engagement and retention. So let me go a little bit deeper into the metrics and how you need to track those metrics. The single most important metric that I would recommend that you track is your retention. And the way to do that is to track what we call as retention cohorts, which are a set of users that come in the same period of time. And you can track daily cohorts of users, you can track weekly cohorts or monthly cohorts. It doesn't matter how you track those users, but you want to track those category of users who are coming in the same period of time and see how that is trending over time. One of the rules that we used, especially for mobile applications, is what I call a 40-20-10 rule, which is to say that if 100% or 100 people come in on day one, you want to see 40 people come in on day one. If 100 people are coming on day 0, you want to see 40 people come in on day 1, 20 people come in on day 7, and 10% or 10 people coming in on day 30. If you can get to that level, then you have a pretty good retention rate. And ultimately, you want to see the retention flatten out, because then you have a certain set of users where you have achieved product market fit. If you look at this chart here, this is a great chart. It shows the retention for the top 10 to top 5,000 applications, and you can see there's a really direct correlation between retention and how popular your application is. And so the top 10 applications in the App Store are achieving between 50 to 60% retention versus the other category of applications. And so to me, again, retention is one of the most important metrics that you can track, because you can now build out an installed base of users that grows over time. And as you build out your installed base of users, these are the users who will then spread the word of mouth to other users, and then that will drive your long-term growth of the business. So we talked about retention. The next thing that I would suggest that you track is engagement. Engagement can be measured in a number of different ways. The primary measure of engagement is measuring your daily active users, your monthly active users, and then tracking the ratio of your daily active users to monthly active users. The higher that ratio, the higher the engagement, the higher the retention that you're seeing. You can also use different definitions of what an active user is. Most people consider somebody to be an active user if they're just logging in to the application, but you might want to have a more stringent definition. You might say that the user has to perform a certain task to really be considered active, and that can be another measure of how engaged the users are with your application. You want to track other metrics like time on site, and more time that people are spending over a period of time, the more engaging the application is becoming for those users. And then finally, if the application allows for contributions, you want to also understand what percentage of your users are contributors, and how active those contributions are, how active those contributors are. So these are all measures of engagement that you should consider and track, and that'll give you a better sense of the type of engagement that you're getting. And you want to see your charts increasing, your engagement increasing over time. That'll give you the confidence that you are achieving product market fit. The other way that you can also track how your product is doing with your customers is to ask them how they would feel if they could no longer use your product. And then track what percentage of them say that they would be very disappointed. If more than 40% say that they would be disappointed or very disappointed, then there's a good chance that you have achieved product market fit. If it's between 25 to 40%, then there's still more work to do. You might want to think about pivoting or repositioning, retargeting your customer segments. And then if you have less than 25% saying that they're very disappointed, then you're clearly not achieving product market fit. You want to, at that point, consider pivoting your solution, keeping a burn rate low, and then iterating on your product till you get to over 40% who are saying that they would be very disappointed that they could no longer use your product. So finally, let me, before we get into our interview, let me discuss a case study with OfferUp, which we talked about a little bit earlier. OfferUp is a Seattle-based startup that's now a unicorn. They provide a marketplace for used goods. And they, as I mentioned before, the previous incumbent in the marketplace was Craigslist, which is still a successful marketplace, but has now been eclipsed by OfferUp. OfferUp actually, if you look at this chart here, this is a chart showing the ranking of their mobile application. They actually floundered for the first 2 years because they couldn't really build a critical mass of users in specific markets, which is essential. Having a critical mass of users is really essential to creating a strong and vibrant marketplace. It's only in 2013 when Facebook introduced the ability for applications to market on their platform to allow people to download that application, that they could actually target users in the Seattle market. So instead of launching on a nationwide basis, which would have made it very difficult to create critical mass really anywhere, they decided to focus only on the Seattle market. And they were able to, on Facebook, target their advertising by specific zip codes. And what they found was that they were able to finally create a vibrant marketplace in the Seattle ecosystem. And they made it really easy for people to post using the mobile device. They were able to make it very easy for people to post used items from their phone. And that drove a high level of inventory of used items, which created a liquid marketplace that ultimately made the application really successful in the Seattle market. They also provided for in-app messaging, which allowed users to, sellers and buyers to rapidly communicate with each other, negotiate, and then consummate the purchase. And so all of these factors really contributed to their being able to create a nice critical mass in the Seattle market. And then once they had, developed that playbook for a specific market, they were able to then expand into Portland and other cities. And then on the basis of their success in those cities, they were able to then raise a significant amount of money that then allowed them to grow into 50 different markets around the country. And now they're the top marketplace for used goods in the US. So that's a great example of a company that initially floundered in achieving product market fit, but once they had really the ability to target people by zip code, they were able to create critical mass and ultimately succeed with their application. So that's essentially what I had planned to cover today before we go into our next part of the session. I want to kind of reiterate some of the points I'd made earlier, which is before you enter a specific market, really try to understand the dynamics of the market. Are there existing incumbents? How are they positioned with customers? Is there a platform shift or technology innovation that you can leverage, or is there a global industry transformation that you can leverage to really get in front of customers? So that's the first step in the process, because without that, even if you have a great product, you will not be successful. And then the next step is to interview customers, make sure that there is a really burning need for your product, and then you want to make sure that you iterate with your MVP, track the retention engagement metrics, and iterate through that process, pivot as necessary to achieve the product market fit for your product. So with that, let me take a few questions. So one question was, you said it's difficult to displace incumbent operators. Would operating at a different price point help? That certainly is a possibility. For example, I gave the example of LiveMocha, which was a language learning app that I launched in 2007. At that time, Rosetta Stone was the incumbent in the marketplace. And certainly there were factors like globalization and so forth, and social networking that allowed us to, transform the marketplace. But we launched with a free product, whereas Rosetta Stone was charging for its product, and so we were able to get substantial growth because we offered a free product. So there are certainly strategies that you can pursue, but if customers have significant investments in existing incumbents, it can still be hard to displace, because it's not just the price point of a product, it's also the investment that they have in their product. All right, the next question was, does a survey count as a precursor to product market fit without giving too much information away? So one thing I want to emphasize to people, entrepreneurs on this session is I've come across a lot of people who are afraid of, giving out their secret about their product, and they're afraid that somebody might copy their ideas. And I really want to emphasize the importance of learning as much as possible. You should certainly do surveys, customer interviews, etc., but don't be afraid of giving out information. It's really important for you to learn. And at the end of the day, it's your execution that's going to allow you to be successful in the marketplace. You have the example of, Friendster, and then MySpace and Facebook. Ultimately, it was Facebook's execution that allowed it to be successful, whereas the others failed in the marketplace because they couldn't really, build a great product. So don't be afraid about sharing information about your product, because you want to learn as much as possible. All right, the next question is, what is the typical time between your survey and MVP, as the market can change in the meantime? Great question. My rule of thumb, tip is typically for a B2C product is you need to be in the market from ideation to product, or at least an MVP, within 3 months. For B2B product, maybe you can take longer because, there's more stuff to be built. Maybe it's, 3 to 6 months. But you want to be in the market as quickly as possible, testing and iterating, because there's a good chance that I'm not so concerned about the market changing. In the meantime, I'll be more concerned about competition, because if you have an idea, there's a good chance that there are 5 other startups who have the same idea, and it's going to be the company that can iterate effectively and quickly that's going to be successful. All right. Next question is, armed with customer problems, is there a common approach to determining how to prioritize update to product and focus on adding features to your product? Commonly or widely used effective approach. So this goes back to the metrics. And so as you are building out your product, your MVP, you need to have certain hypotheses as to what is successful for you, what's going to be successful for you to improve those metrics, right? And so you have to have a certain hypothesis for what's going to help you improve those metrics, and then you need to build out the features that then address that hypothesis and help you improve your engagement, help you improve your retention. So that's really what should drive your MVP process, is what's going to help you improve those metrics and ultimately get to product market fit. All right, next question is, not all products are connected. What are some strategies to evaluate customer engagement? I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Let's see, Anu, can you rephrase that question again for me? Can you let me unmute you? Do you want to ask your question again?
The question is, if the product is not a connected product, if it is not connected to a device that is connected to the internet, for example.
I see. Okay.
How do I figure out if people are using the product in the manner that we envision it to be, be used? What is the customer engagement and things like that?
Okay. So first of all, a great question. First of all, I would say that as much as possible, look for connecting that device into the internet. Most devices today are really being built to connect to the internet in some form or shape, ideally through Wi-Fi or even through Bluetooth, connecting to your phone, etc. So as much as possible, try to do that. But if that's not possible, really the only way that you can collect information about customer engagement is by surveying your customers, maybe asking your customers to keep a diary, and you might want to give them some incentive in the form of money or gift cards or whatever, to keep a daily diary of their usage of the product. So that's really the only way I think you can get information from customers about their engagement. All right. Next question is from Milind. Please tell more about B2B context. Milind, can you elaborate more on that? I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Basically, like the numbers which you shared appears perfectly for a B2C kind of a context. But in B2B, usually what happens is a number of customers are comparatively less, and the size of a customer can be very high. So in that situation, many times it happens that a particular kind of customer is giving response in one direction and another is giving response in another direction.
Yeah.
So in that situation, usually there is a confusion. So how to handle that?
I think still that there are some basic metrics that still make sense for a B2B product, right? You want to see how often your customers are logging in, engaging with your product. You want to, you want to make sure that they are coming back and using your product. You might have certain metrics that you're tracking about their specific activity or usage, right? So there are still metrics that you can track with your customers that can give you a sense of whether they are engaging and whether the engagement is improving over time. But to make sure that you're not getting signals in different directions, one of the strategies that I mentioned is to make sure that you're targeting customers in the same customer segment. So you might want to just target companies in a very specific vertical segment or location or something where you're more likely to get similar kinds of feedback from your customers. So that's another strategy that you can use to really get and aggregate your customer feedback and give you some direction with regards to your product.
Sure, thank you.
Okay. All right, next question is from Sandeep. Does an MVP have to be sellable or just usable by a small subset without making money? Definitely. I don't think that you have to charge your customers to try out your MVP. If you're a B2B product, you may want to set it up so that there are certain metrics that you need to achieve. And if at the end of your trial, you've achieved those metrics with the customer, then they're obliged to buy the product. But definitely, if you are trying to get your MVP out, you don't need to charge for it to get a sense for how your customers are engaging and using the product. All right, next question is from Protostar. How to choose between a mobile versus desktop experience? Is it okay to go 100% mobile strategy for MVP or better to launch both? Our product is 70% mobile B2C product. So again, as a startup, you have very limited resources. I would recommend, when you launch your product, to focus on a very limited platform. So definitely, if you have a choice between mobile and desktop and 70% are mobile, then just focus on mobile. And even in the mobile space, focus on one platform, whether it's iOS or Android, because you will need to go through a lot of iteration, and it's too expensive to try to iterate on multiple platforms at the same time. OfferUp is a great example of a company which launched initially only on iOS, and they kind of perfected their product market fit on the iOS platform before going to the Android platform. All right, I think the final question I'll take here before we go to our interview is it reasonable to use a Kickstarter campaign to gauge product market fit, to find out if there's appetite for the product? Kickstarter can be a reasonable way to test if there's a value proposition that is resonating with the market. Typically, Kickstarter works with mostly hardware products or games. May not work really well with a SaaS-based product or a software product. And at best, what you can understand or gauge is the value proposition resonating with the market, because they're buying, at the end of the day, they have to buy your, whatever item that you're providing through the Kickstarter campaign. But you still need to track the engagement and retention metrics to make sure that the product is being successful, because you may have a situation where you're successful with the Kickstarter campaign and selling your items on Kickstarter, but it fizzles out because you haven't really achieved engagement with your product. All right, so I think those were all the questions that came in. We will now go into the next part of our session, which is an interview with Avni Patel Thompson. Let me unmute Avni.
Hi.
Avni, you there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let me do a quick introduction for Avni. She's the founder and CEO of Modern Village. She is a third-time founder building technology solutions for today's parents. Her previous company, Poppy, helped connect parents to better caregivers when they had gaps in childcare. Before starting Poppy, she spent over a decade building big consumer businesses at P&G, Adidas, and Starbucks. She has an MBA at Harvard Business School and a BSc in chemistry from University of British Columbia. And she lives in Vancouver with her husband and 2 little girls. So welcome, Avni.
Thank you.
So today we're going to spend time with Avni, primarily with regards to her experience with Poppy and how she went about achieving product market fit, as well as the challenges that she had in getting to business model fit with Poppy. And then also we'll talk a little bit about her experience with Modern Village. So with that, Avni, can you talk about what was the pain point that you were trying to address with Poppy?
Yeah, so by way of context, I guess through that intro, maybe it's just a little bit helpful to have a little bit of the background of how I ended up in entrepreneurship and starting companies, especially in this space. But most of my career was spent in what you'd call very traditional corporate kind of spaces. My husband and I moved around a lot for those jobs, from Toronto to Cincinnati to Boston. We lived in China for a while. And we came back to Boston to have our first daughter, and then we moved to Seattle to get closer to my family up in Vancouver. And so my husband was at Amazon, I was at Starbucks. And around that time for me, started to really realize just a lot of the pain points that I was feeling and that my friends were feeling in just being parents, and especially being dual working parents, not having family in town, and just all of the friction that created. And so for me, as someone that has lived her life working on consumer products and consumer problems, that was really interesting, especially because if you think about a market, parents and willingness to pay and kind of like the size of share of wallet kind of thing is significant. And this is one of those like daily kind of problems that people were facing. And so that's what ultimately my story of entrepreneurship is very much led by problems that I face in my life, even though I spent over a decade solving problems that maybe I was the consumer, maybe I wasn't. And so I was trained to be able to solve problems that I didn't myself face. But I found when starting from zero and trying to imagine a completely different world and future and building a product to serve that, the best thing that I've found is picking a problem that I myself am experiencing and I feel very passionate about. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but that's really what has driven a lot of the search for product market fit, is that becoming obsessed with a problem that you feel very compelled to solve sort of gives you the energy to then do the subsequent kind of iteration and the experimentation. But for me, it very much was driven by this fact that being that both of us working and trying to make all of this work, I found big opportunities to say, how can we make this experience better? And so for Poppy, a lot of that was not saying, oh, I've got a really great idea. And it's interesting because I have an MBA. I come from pretty classically the place that you could start with a business case and a really extensive business plan. But what I've found is more effective is trying to understand what's the problem that you're trying to solve for, what is the experience, and then certainly you have to do the research to back it up and say, is this a big enough market? Could there be a bigger kind of opportunity there? But in the early days, I find there's bigger challenges and bigger traps in falling into, I'm going to research the heck out of a problem before you actually put anything out there. So happy to chat a little bit more, but my my path to kind of even coming to the problem was very much driven by the problems that I had in my life.
Right. So can you tell me more about the problem that you saw for yourself with childcare?
Yeah, so it wasn't even childcare in the first instance. It was this fact that what was it that made it very hard for both my husband and I had to have demanding jobs and to have two girls under 3 years old. And so for me, it was like, really, what are the friction points? And one of those biggest ones that for me and for my fellow friends and others that I talked to, it was this idea that maybe you would wake up and your nanny would call in sick, or your child was sick and can't go to daycare, or your husband is traveling and you have to stay late for a meeting. It was all of these little gaps in childcare, or like having someone to care for your children and not having someone to be able to just text or call and say, hey, I'm like, I'm running late or whatever. Can you, go and pick up the girls or whatever, or can you watch them for half an hour? Lots of different why now reasons. We're moving around a lot, so we don't live close to the communities or our parents that we grew up with. Communities and neighborhoods aren't necessarily, right now is an interesting kind of point post-COVID, but, generally speaking, we don't know our neighbors and we don't know them well enough that you'd call them and say, hey, can you come over for like 20 minutes while I do this call or whatever it is. And parenting has just changed, like the necessity of driving your kids around again, pre-COVID, but all of that sort of for me was the analysis of like, that's the challenge. And then the next thing was for me to say, okay, well, what would solve that? I don't know the realities of it, but what would make it feel amazing for me and be a really great solution? And the most amazing solution for me would be that I would have that person, that I could just text someone and say, hey, I'm in a bind. I need someone tomorrow from noon to 4. And someone would just text, that's someone that I trust would just text me back and say, you're covered. I've got you. And, I'll be there. And so that's really the seed of what then eventually was Poppy, what eventually was a two-sided managed marketplace, all the different things that you have to then go figure out. But in the very earliest days, especially because I didn't come from a tech background, my intention was not necessarily to build a venture-backed startup. It was very much driven by that problem and the definition of what is the higher level problem, and then what are some solutions that could serve that. And that's what then kind of led down the path of all of the other things.
Got it. So clearly you had a problem, yourself. Did you, before you decided to actually go about solving it, did you validate the problem with other parents and to see, hey, are you seeing the same problems? Did you try to ascertain if there's a wider need in the marketplace?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because for me, I knew there was a wider problem. Like, just if you were in any of the parent groups, or if you talked to anyone at just over dinner or soccer games or birthday parties or anything, like top 3 topic is childcare kind of challenges. And so I certainly knew it was a problem. But even then, once I started to have ideas around this space, yeah, I would talk to different folks and I'd say, okay, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what specifically is the issue? And then certain themes would come out. I feel unqualified to be able to go and figure out if this person is qualified to provide childcare, if they're safe and trustworthy. Okay, so there was some theme around vetting and qualification. There would be some theme around when I need someone, no one's available. So there was something around availability and making that really easy. So you'd start to in talking to people, I knew generally there was a big problem. But then once I would just start talking to people, and through the talking to people, it was, I could kind of figure out what a model was. The other thing I have is that in this case, which is actually very different from my new company, in this case, it was a very crowded market. Childcare is not a new thing. There's nanny agencies, there's care.com, there's all sorts of things up and down the value chain of things. And so a lot of that was trying to understand what are existing solutions and where do existing solutions fall short, and where might a new thing, what is the unique insight to be able to solve this in a new way. So that was a lot of I would call it maybe the first 2 months of just kind of think of maybe 2 to 2.5, 3 months. I would even, and to your point, I think one of the first questions was how do you share things without giving too much away? I couldn't say this more strongly to any budding entrepreneurs, give all your ideas away, talk about them. You have more to lose by not talking about your ideas than you do like with the risk of someone stealing your idea. I couldn't agree more with that, that the execution is like the hardest thing about startups. And so in that period of time, I talked to literally everyone I could about this idea and tried to get senses of like, where are you a little uncomfortable with that? And like, you know, you refine the idea. Part of being an entrepreneur is constantly selling a story. And it might sound like I'm selling a rehearsed thing, but it's all market research. I'm telling you a thing, seeing how it resonates, getting that feedback and putting it back in to kind of do it a little bit differently the next time. And so that was a lot of like the first maybe 2-3 months. And then quickly, the other context I should say is this was coming on the heels of another thing that I'd been working on, and I recently shut it down. And I had no intention of starting another company or another startup. In fact, I was interviewing for going back to like, you know, working at it like a regular kind of big job and all that kind of stuff. And so for me, a lot of this was trying to provide some data why I should go work on this instead of just going and working at it like another big job. And so a lot of this is important context because I didn't have a lot of time. I mean, I had 2 young girls, we had bills and all that kind of stuff. We didn't have like endless time that I could go without an income. And so some of that drove the urgency in very good ways that I'm thankful for now. But I basically put in like, I took a month, and I think the month was like maybe March, if I recall correctly. 4 weeks that I said, I'm going to come up with a very light prototype, like an MVP. I'm going to put it into market. I am going to charge money for it. It wasn't a lot. It was $5, I think, per booking. But it was enough to say that the feedback I would get actually was worth more than free. And it was based on that 4-week kind of test, what I would say, and it kind of took off that ultimately kind of led to what we can get into, but like the semblance of product market fit and then what everything else that came subsequently.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about kind of your initial entry in the market. It was done in a very non-tech fashion, as I understand, which is very interesting because you know, a lot of people think that we have to build all this technology before we can even enter the market. So so talk more about, you know, how you did that without a lot of technology, and then what is the response you were seeing, and then how did you kind of evolve that product over time?
Yeah, so I've got lots of thoughts on this, and it's interesting because I don't know that there is one right way, but I think that approach was very much led by necessity. But I think if you are an engineer, there's this very real risk that you just fall into the building trap, which is you will build for like a year and then you kind of release it to great fanfare, and then you know, that's like the very classic kind of story of like, well, you built a product in search of a market. For me, it was a little bit different in the sense that I couldn't, like, in fact, I was looking for someone that could build me an app because I could see it as an app. It was like, this is the time of like Uber and all sorts of different things. So I could see the screens, I could see the interaction of how that could work. But I didn't have the money to fund like a dev shop, nor did I have a friend that could just kind of build it for me on the side or things like that. And so this was very much driven by necessity, that I was trying to figure out how could I approximate the solution or the experience enough to at least prove that this thing needed to exist in the world, and that would buy me time to then do the next thing. And ultimately, this is very much driven my philosophy in entrepreneurship, which is just focus on the biggest problem in front of you. That buys you time to then solve the next problem, and then ultimately that kind of gets you kind of going forward. And that helps drive a lot of the prioritization, because again, I think that was one of the other questions. There's a lot of problems you could work, or a lot of pieces you could work on, and what drives that prioritization. I think you can figure out what is the most urgent kind of ones. But for me, what this looked like was taking a step back and saying, what am I ultimately trying to do? I'm trying to, over here, find and vet childcare providers. And so, okay, let's break that down. What does that look like? Okay, well, let's probably start with people who are already sitters or nannies. Let's find, because I'm myself a mom, like I've done this before. I've had to go find sitters and nannies and I've interviewed them. And I sat down, I said, okay, what's the very best kind of, if I was a mom and I was saying like, okay, I want to trust someone, what is all the process of like, I'd want to do? Okay, I'd want to do an interview. I'd want to do a background check. I'd want to do all these different things. And so I came up with sort of like a 7-step vetting process, which eventually ended up being like automated, and a whole CMS or a whole applicant ATS tracking system was built around it. But in the first instance, it was just me writing down 7 steps, and I carried that forward with like 3 UW students. and found them and kind of said, hey, I'm working on this new thing. I'll help you get, babysitting jobs and make it easier for you to connect with families. And then on the other side, we lived in Madison Park. And so there was a lot of families that were posting in like Nextdoor and other places for sitters and nannies. And so I didn't know them, but I just emailed 15 parents and I said, hey, I've got these 3 amazing people. If you have gaps in care, if you need them sometime, like just text this phone number. And I gave them my personal phone number. And it was a complete test. It was a complete, like I hit send and I didn't really think that anything, like I really was skeptical that something would happen. But later that day, we ended up getting our first booking. And then it was the matter of, okay, how do I actually do this? And so in the very earliest instance, it was me just texting back and forth both parties, right? So like, okay, can you do this time? Can you do this time? It feels very inefficient, but there's a lot of learning going on, because once you can map over all the different steps that have to happen, it's much easier to now go and identify this piece and automate it and make it a little bit more efficient. So what started with a day planner and me literally writing down bookings, then turned into Google Calendar. With Google Calendar, actually, we ended up using Google Calendar for like maybe a year. We just we just built on top of the API then, and we continued to kind of send invites out. But that was probably critical, because for Poppy, what I would say is that from a high level product market fit, we probably hit that like immediately, especially on the parent side. Now there's a lot of complexity that I'll get into, which is like related around price points and business model and things like that. But from the point of, I've got a problem and you're solving it for me and I'm willing to pay you money for it, we had that. And then on the caregiver side, equally, which is important in a two-sided marketplace, they also had problems that were important enough that they were willing to come to us to have them solved for them. And so in the first instance, that first month of test, the other part, I think, I'm sure you mentioned this, which is like, you have to have a core metric. That has to be your North Star. And so for me, the core metric was bookings, because if we grew the number of bookings week on week, that meant the whole system was working. That meant more people wanted, and of course you can break that down, but like more people wanted what we were building, and we were able to successfully kind of, make the whole system work, connect them to caregivers. And so I can't remember the specific numbers. Maybe it was like 4 or 5 bookings the first week, maybe 7 or 8 the next week, 10, 12, but like there was a constant maybe 20% growth rate every single week. And though really, really small numbers, the growth rate is what you're trying to look for, and what eventually kind of really proved out that people needed this, and it was worth kind of like then continuing to build out.
Great. So then, so you clearly you were achieving, product market fit, and then you were starting to automate different parts of the, service. But then you ran into issues around kind of the business model. So which made it difficult to scale the service. So talk more about kind of the business model aspect.
So this is where it gets complicated. So if we were talking about starting this in 2015 or so, it wasn't until like 2018 that so there was still 3 years of building and really seeing really positive kind of metrics and stuff before we were able to kind of say like the scalability is really at risk. And so to kind of rewind the in-between kind of pieces, based on some of that early growth, we did Y Combinator, we raised a seed round, we with a lot of really amazing investors, and we came, and I say came back because we went and did YC, came back to Seattle and continued to grow it out. And there were a lot, as you can imagine, if you're trying to do something where you're trying to find caregivers and you're trying to go into somebody's home and care for their children at a really, really high level of quality, there's trust and safety stuff, there's operations things, there's like up and down. This is a very complicated kind of business to not only create, but then week in, week out, kind of do that really well. And so we built up an incredible team to kind of do all this. The challenges, though, are for anyone that's even looked at two-sided marketplace, especially service ones, margins and your unit economics are always going to be challenging. And we knew that going in. And so I was always kind of looking at how do we work these unit economics. We had really positive stuff on the parent side in the sense that we didn't pay for acquisition because we were such a great, because we focused on being a really delightful, really great service. Word of mouth worked for us. And so parents would tell other parents, they would sign up, and then, all of that kind of stuff would work. And then eventually that really kind of really worked. We eventually did childcare for the Seahawks on game days, like all sorts of different things. Like in Seattle, Poppy really became like that top tier kind of product and service. And so on parents' side, that was working. I will say with the caveat at a certain price point. It's challenging because as parents, like a lot of us who are working, a lot of our income goes to childcare just in general, whether it's full-time care like nannies and daycares and things like that, or some of these other kind of what you would call sort of like discretionary, but like the additional kind of childcare things. And so we would experiment and test with price points that were a little bit higher in premium, given that we were doing so much in this value chain. But it was always challenging ultimately to be able to kind of charge that. And so then on the caregiver side, what we found is that, and this is going to get a little bit more into detail of like the category of childcare, but it's relevant for this, which I didn't know as a parent who was just building into this space. But childcare, unfortunately, is sort of built upon a system where it requires a lot of like unpaid or underpaid labor. And what I mean by that is it's a lot of women, it's a lot of minorities, it's a lot of folks that do this work because they love it and they do it for, you know, I will say out of the goodness of their heart, but like they're not compensated at the level that they ought to be. And so because there's this level that is sort of within the system, people do it for community, they do it for like, you know, the relationships and things like that. And that was all very important and very present at the smaller scales of Poppy, where it felt like a community thing, where it felt like community sitters were caring for community parents and things like that. Of course, when you start introducing scale, you have to start automating even things like that away. So it starts to feel a little bit more than like a gig job, where, you know, here's a list of jobs that are available for all of these different families. You can take whichever ones you want. You start to optimize, you know, which, you know, if you've got one sitter with 8 hours, you know, what's the optimal kind of load for there? Is it like two bookings with a minimal kind of distance to travel between them? You have to necessarily kind of start thinking about all of these things because those are matters of scale. That though has implications on experience and like what people are kind of looking for. So that's sort of one piece. The second piece is because this job never pays really well in this category. In childcare, you're talking about people making like $14 to $17 an hour in general, and I'm talking about Seattle. Most of that work is done under the table. So most people, you know, it's not paying a lot, but like they don't pay taxes on it. So then maybe it makes it like doable. Well, for us, you do have to like, you know, you have to declare taxes, you have to do the whole thing. And so we started to see again, as you started to grow, for increasingly for a lot of people, it was a good thing for a certain period of time. I'm in between jobs, or I'm in between like, you know, school and grad school, or like, you know, these little transition kind of things. And you would start to see that. And so we would have to start increasingly to keep up with the growth on the parent side. We had to just like find more and more caregivers, and the transient kind of nature made it really difficult. And so these are all things that weren't necessarily relevant in a system that worked really, really well with what you would call product market fit at a certain size. When you're trying to push that to a different inherent scale, that's where things started to kind of fall apart. And that's where the economics, that's where the scalability, that's where the ability to kind of pick this model up and put it into other places came into play, and really proved that this couldn't necessarily do that. It could be a very nice local regional thing, maybe a franchise thing, all that kind of stuff. But it was more examining, is it a venture-backed scalable mass kind of thing? The answer was, as far as I could see, in that way, without other buckets of money from employers and government, no. Got it.
Okay. So was it, you know, you felt you tried all different types of iterations with regards to the scaling?
Yeah.
And then so it was not necessarily an issue of money. You know, you could have gone raise more money, but it just didn't feel like.
No. So I would say it's a little bit of both. So we were very judicious. So this is all stuff that when you're talking about product market fit and raising money, so I think there's like a couple of different pieces, because I think for most people, before you raise your first amount of money, I think like in so much as you're able to, you want to prove that this thing needs to exist in the world, and that this is the problem that you really want to commit the next 7 to 10 years of your life to be doing. That I would do without any kind of money hanging over you, or like any other kind of obligation and all that kind of stuff, is as much as you're able to do that. And that's why I really encourage people to go figure out how can you at least feel like there's some semblance of product market fit before you start, like, you know, really then taking on money and all of these other things, because I think that's where a lot of people kind of get into trouble. But for us, we were able to raise, like post YC, a really solid kind of seed round. But that said, we were always very judicious with it. We made revenue, but we were always running things very lean to be able to elongate that runway. One important thing for me is I've always seen my job is like that money buys you time, and the time buys you time buys you the ability to run experiments. That's what your job as a CEO is, especially pre-true scale product market fit. And in that sense, then, you know, raising a little bit over $2 million, that just bought us more months to be able to do all of this stuff. So we ran as many experiments. We pushed the boundaries as much as we could. As we started to get into the back half of that funding, we were seeing some of the best months that we've ever seen from a results standpoint. But still, like, whether that showed indication of scalability, that still wasn't there. And so, like, that's really interesting because, like, both things can be true. I think the last year before we shut down, we did 2 of our biggest months we've ever done. But just because you do that doesn't make it, like, you know, a scalable kind of company. And the reality is, yeah, we did run out of money. It's not that we ran out of money, it's that you ran out of runway. And so that we always knew that that end was kind of coming. And I could have gone to investors and said, hey, let's do a bridge thing, or like, let's do all these different things. But I think ultimately it was that we had run aggressively as many experiments as we could on this hypothesis. And I couldn't in good conscience say that, like, there were more things to kind of explore. And so at that point, this is a different conversation. At that point, like, that becomes, you know, what do you do with that? But in some ways, I think the money holds you accountable for how, you know, what you're doing to get to yourself to product market fit. Because even for me, as I did go talk to other investors about doing an A and things like that, it was a sort of a collaborative conversation, as there should be, that we're not seeing the metrics of how this scales. And that really then for me was to go back and say, okay, like, how would we have to tweak this? And that sort of drove a lot of other experiments to make it a scale kind of a different product. And that we never got to, like, product market fit on those things.
Great. Okay, great. I mean, it's a very interesting exercise and story about how, you know, the parents really loved it. And from that perspective, you had great product market fit. But when it came to scalability, there really wasn't a, you know, product market fit from that perspective to scale the business.
Yeah. I mean, for me, unfortunately, like, it's a lot more of a math problem. And there's, like, in childcare, especially in this category, there's other factors at play, I think, ultimately, that I was not aware of as a kind of a founder kind of going into this. And that's sort of like then has implications on how you kind of do this. And so it's a lesson for other folks as well, is that be very aware of, like, some of these other kind of things that might not be completely in your control to be able to solve. And maybe there's a lesson in there, like, you know, as you're kind of thinking about product market fit, there's a broader definition of, like, making sure that you're not operating, like, for some folks who are operating in fintech or health or the care and things like that, some of that is very apparent. But in some of these other ones that, you know, you think you can kind of out innovate it, you have to be very, you still have to keep that kind of on the sidelines.
Okay, great. So there's some questions from the audience. I'll read it out to you.
Sure.
So one question is from Anu. Do you feel the Harvard MBA gave you perspective and tools that allowed you to be successful that otherwise would not have been possible, or could have been more difficult?
So I think my MBA in general, I think gave me a lot of skills. I think for me, ultimately, my MBA has given me skills in how to run a company. So what I mean by that is, it's interesting. For me, I, like, value my YC, my Y Combinator experience and my HBS experience almost, like, equally, but in very, very different ways. I think getting a new company, or, like, it's not even a company, getting a startup off the ground is, like, very much the very not glorious matter of trying to solve something, and you have to do everything. You have to do everything from, like, emailing your talking to your users to, like, you know, doing all the email stuff. Like, you literally have to do everything. It's not glorious. There's nothing fancy about it. It's really down in the weeds, and you almost have to, like, step away from the theory. You have to step away from the business plan, step away from the theory, because if you keep yourself in the theory, you're never going to get down to actually doing the thing and launching it and getting into the mess of actually having to figure out what people want. Because you're always like stuck in the theoretical part. That said, once we got Poppy up and going, once I had to hire people, once I had to fire people, once I had to like actually figure out how do we delegate so that all of this stuff happens and we're running as fast as we can and we're building a company, that's really where, and then we had to like innovate on different business models. Like how could it be subscription? Could it be transactional revenue? Like all of that stuff. That's where my MBA came into handy, because I have like through cases and all that other kind of stuff, understood how nuanced things are and how to think through things in multiple types of layers. I've been exposed to different business models, different types of things. And then from like a network standpoint, I could call up folks that, you know, are either dealing with things like this. So I would say, yes, absolutely. It's been helpful for me, but by no means do I think it's a necessary thing. I think like there's so many other ways to kind of get there. I think it gives me a lot of, I don't know, like obviously I find benefit in it, but I don't want that to be a lesson in like only the people that have these pedigrees and have this kind of training. This entrepreneurship is not about training. It is about grit. It's about perseverance. It's about like, you know, being obsessed with a problem and being the one that wants to be there and solve it day in and day out. That you don't need an MBA for.
All right. Next question is from Anu. When you're providing a marketplace such as a nanny service that doubles the problem acquisition of customers and service providers, how did you go about striking a balance between acquisition of both of these? How do you convince a service provider that you need to be on your platform?
Yeah, and honestly, so I'm like a good friends with a lot of marketplace founders, like OfferUp and like other ones, because like we joke that you have to be a special, you have to like a special kind of pain to want to go build a marketplace. Because not only most companies have to solve one set of like acquisition and like, you know, CAC and LTV kind of things. In marketplaces, you have to solve at least two, right? And you always have, nothing is ever in equilibrium. If you solved it on the supply side, now you have to go get more demand. If you solve it on the demand side, now you don't have enough supply. You're never able to kind of rest or like, you know, say like, oh, everything's kind of working really well. For us, it was being very strategic about understanding what drove each of them. And I think I mentioned this before, but on the parent side, I could see a successful strategy where we did not have to pay for parent acquisition. We did at certain points, if like, you know, we brought on a bunch of supply, we would have to like, you know, maybe we did referral programs and things like that on demand side to get that going. But ultimately, we knew that if we built a really great product that was dependable and trustworthy and just really great, that parents would tell each other. And so for what it's worth, and you know, grateful for it, but for us on the demand side, it would just keep on coming. In fact, we had to stop demand a lot of times. We would have to put people on wait lists and things like that. And so demand side, from an acquisition standpoint, we didn't necessarily have to worry about too much. Supply side was then, we had a whole group against it. Like I had, ever since from basically like, our first hire was in charge of caregiver, not only just acquisition, but just head of caregiver stuff. Because we knew that we were always going to be supply constrained. And so we put our resources against that. And then from an economic standpoint, one thing for like anyone who's building a marketplace to be aware of is you want to remove friction from your more constrained side. And what that means is that, for example, if I'm supply constrained, if I'm constrained from caregivers, we didn't have them pay us anything. All the payment stuff on our business model came from the parent side. You could have something like Airbnb that takes a little bit from both sides. You could have it from other models which pay suppliers to list their supply, and then you don't have you know, the demand side pay. Those are like all sorts of different things, but that's how we thought about it, which is we were always supply constrained. We put the model such that it was, we would get the parents to pay all of it, and then we would focus on the caregiver side, acquisition and retention.
Okay, great. Next question is, how did you scale with providers? Did you consider childcare providers in addition to nanny caregivers as well? And how did you build the pipeline of providers?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, and this like kind of laddering it up to the bigger point of like product market fit, is that, again, I have a degree in chemistry. So like, I think like a scientist. I think all of this has to be reduced to first principles. I think when you're trying to build something new, you could definitely look at what competitors do, or like what other people do, or what should you do, or like all this kind of stuff. I've found it more instructive to say, what is the problem you're trying to solve, and what are the first principles of each of the things that kind of underlie it? Because I think that's more instructive to then say, like, what should I do in that kind of space? So in this case, what I knew is that I needed people who are dependable and are capable of providing childcare. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, you probably have done it before and have some experience. Okay, so what does that mean? And you kind of broke it down so that ultimately we didn't have to go look for people that had label sitter or label nanny, because those are also bad labels in today's society. You could also go find people that had been lifeguards and soccer coaches and art teachers and stay-at-home moms and retirees. And so in the end, that's why we called them poppies, because these existing labels just didn't work, and they didn't do credence to what our ultimate thesis was, which is in our communities. It's also why I talk about this idea of village. It's not about the labels. It's that fact that we all live in communities that lots of people are capable and qualified to be able to provide childcare. There's just no really great efficient system to unearth them. And so ultimately that's exactly it. We of course started with the lowest CAC things, which was go find the people that already identify themselves as sitters and nannies. But then from there, once we were able to use that data set to say, okay, this is what true qualification and quality and all that looks like, we built out that kind of funnel. Then we could open up the aperture and say anybody that meets these criteria are able to be a caregiver. And you know what the incredible thing there is? We had a lot more men, we had a lot more other folks that people might not otherwise consider classic caregivers, but they had to meet the very, very stringent criteria that we had, everything from background checks to experience to references, all that kind of stuff. But when you do that, you enable people that might otherwise have been overlooked to be able to rise to meet a bar that has already been set. And that was probably one of the most the things that I'm most kind of proud of. But that's, yeah, it's sort of taking a first principles look at any of the problems that you're trying to tackle.
All right, one final question is you once believed that childcare was a big pain point for parents. Could you please elaborate on why the product was not scalable? What were the other factors in childcare space that you referred to?
Yeah, I still think it's a massive problem. I still think it's a massive big pain point. And I think I touched on a couple of those pieces, but really what I talk about now is that to be, I think to build a sustainable business here, you have to charge something like $40. The caregiver has to make something like $40 an hour. That first of all is a non-starter for parents. I can't afford $40 an hour to pay a caregiver, but that's what they should be paid for, the level of experience and quality and all that kind of stuff, to make that a true profession for the type of work that they're doing. Parents, though, what I would love to make it sustainable, I'd love to pay something like $10 an hour. And so now the really interesting question for anyone who's a budding entrepreneur and wants to take this on, which is how do you make that work? How do you make the provider get paid $40 an hour, and how do you make the parents pay only $10 an hour, or even less potentially? Now you start getting into group care or centers or things like that, which have their own kind of challenges, but that I think is still a big old opportunity waiting to be kind of solved. So I still think there's a massive problem and opportunity. For my take on it, I'm interested, having kind of looked at all the problems of parents, I'm even more interested in the role of software and technology and how it can continue to help parents in their lives. So for me, and especially this new company, it's a little bit less explicitly childcare, and it's a little bit more the role of technology in helping parents' lives be better.
Okay. All right, I think there's still a few questions, but I just want to be mindful of time for everyone. And so we'll stop at this point. So thanks again, Avni, for sharing your experience, very interesting experience with Poppy, and wish you all the best with your new venture, Modern Village.
Thank you.
All right, so thanks everyone, folks. Next week's session will be about go-to-market strategy, and we are fortunate to have two individuals, one of whom has a strong B2B background, and the other person has a strong B2C background, and they'll be there to present how to go about building your go-to-market strategy. So see you all next Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific. Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.